It was 1882, on the far edge of New Mexico territory, a land of endless sagebrush and scattered mesquite, where the wind carried dust and memories alike. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Grant Steele had carved out a life here, 3 years of quiet labor in a log cabin he'd raised with his own hands. He tended a few head of cattle hunted when meat ran low, and spoke only when he had to. Folks in the nearest settlement hardly mentioned his name anymore. He rarely went there, except for flour coffee or a box of cartridges. At 38, he was older than most men, still trying to wrest a living from this harsh country. Sun and sorrow had left deep lines at the corners of his eyes. He kept his words clipped and steady. After burying his beloved Rose Steele in Texas, he had sold off everything and drifted west until he found a patch of ground where no one knew his past. He hadn't come seeking fortune or fame, just a way to keep breathing without leaning on anyone. Grant's world was simple: a sturdy bay gelding named Ironfoot, a few cattle, a Winchester rifle, and the pine-scented cabin with its small corral. That was enough to make the next sunrise worth facing, or so he told himself. Ironfoot wasn't just a horse. The scarred, strong-backed gelding hauled timber from the hills, packed supplies from town, and stood as the one living thing Grant trusted completely. Losing him would mean more than walking on foot. It would mean another piece of Grant's soul torn away. Late one dusty evening, Grant returned from mending a fence on the West Line shirt, stiff with sweat and hands raw from wire. He stopped cold. The corral gate stood unlatched. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he'd simply forgotten, but he never forgot. His chest tightened. Dropping the coil of wire, he strode to the pen. The rope tie dangled loose. Fresh hoof marks scored the dirt. No sign of Ironfoot. Grant gripped the post until splinters bit his palm. He drew a harsh breath. Not a word left his mouth. The gelding had either bolted or been driven off. He couldn't tell which. Lantern in hand, he followed the trail 100 yards into the brush until fading light erased the prints. The pattern said the horse had run free, frightened by something. Maybe coyotes, maybe a rider. Beyond that, the dry ground told nothing. Ironfoot might already be miles away. By sundown, frustration pressed against Grant's ribs like a vice. He muttered a curse meant only for himself for not hearing the escape, for not checking the latch sooner. Boots dragging, he trudged back to the cabin. The silence felt wider and sharper than ever. Inside, the one-room shelter seemed to shrink around him, the iron stove, the plain table, the single bedroll. None of it filled the hollowness left by the absent sound of hooves outside. He set his rifle by the door and paced thoughts circling like buzzards over carrion. He pictured Ironfoot caught in a gully or claimed by another man. Without the horse, 20 miles to town might as well have been 100. Winter wood supplies hunting everything depended on that animal. Grant pulled a chair to the window and sat motionless, eyes fixed on the dark yard. Every creak of timber or sigh of wind set his hand twitching toward the rifle. Hours passed. Unbidden memories of Texas bled back Rose's final breath, the stillness after the lonely grave. Tonight's silence felt the same, like the world stripping him bare, one piece at a time. Near midnight, he stepped outside, coat drawn tight. The empty corral yawned like a wound. He tied the gate shut, though it meant nothing, now set the lantern on the porch rail and stared at the horizon. Borrow another man's horse. He knew the scornful answer. What's a man worth if he can't hold his own stock? He would not be that man. Fear gnawed at him, not of hunger or raiders, but of losing the last tether to life itself. Ironfoot was his work, his safety, his last true partner. Without that gelding, he'd be just another drifter with a shack. He forced himself to patrol the yard once more. The land lay still except for a coyote's distant cry and the whisper of night wind. No hoofbeats, no shape he recognized. The weight in his gut sank heavier. Back inside, Grant set the rifle within reach and lowered the lantern flame. But sleep would not come. Every creak of the cabin made him sit up. Every rustle of wind spiked his pulse. He vowed to rise with first light food and canteen ready and track Ironfoot as far as needed. Fists clenched, he swore under his breath he wouldn't lose that gelding without a fight. When the first thin gray of dawn pushed through the window, his eyes burned from a sleepless night. Boots already on, he sat rigid and listened, waiting for whatever the morning might bring. For a long stretch of stillness, nothing stirred. Then a faint, steady drumming of hooves broke the gray dawn. Grant Steele's chest tightened like a cinched rope. He froze, every muscle wired toward the sound. The rhythm grew clearer, slow, uneven, as if the horse had been pushed through the night. Grant stepped into the doorway. Winchester ready in his grip, heart hammering harder than he cared to admit. Dim morning light spilled across the yard, turning every outline strange. Out of the mist came Ironfoot, his bay coat lathered with sweathead hanging low flanks, streaked with foam. Relief hit Grant sharp and sudden, then stopped cold when he saw who rode bareback on the gelding. A young woman clung to the horse with quiet strength. Her knees pressed the animal's sides, dark hair hanging in wild, wind-snarled waves. Sun had bronzed her skin, her cheekbones cut clean and proud. Her buckskin dress was torn at the collar and clung to her hips, the fabric ripped from hard travel. Bare feet dangled on either side, raw and scraped. She made no cry for help, no plea, only watched him breath fast, a warning and a question in one. Grant's grip on the rifle tightened. It's runaway's trouble, riding straight into his yard. He thought of what the Dust Creek settlers would whisper if they learned an Apache woman had come to his land. Jaw locked, he kept the barrel low but didn't raise it. Instead, he studied her eyes. There was fear there. Yes, but guarded not the wild panic of someone about to strike. It echoed the quiet ache he'd carried for years. Ironfoot halted on his own sides, heaving. The woman slid down with care, knees buckling from exhaustion before she straightened bare feet, sinking into the dirt. She said nothing, just stood steady as a fence post. Her silence rattled him more than a scream would have. He half expected her to collapse. Questions crowded his mind. How had she found his horse? Had Ironfoot sought her out? Was someone hunting her even now? Grant stepped forward, boots heavy on packed earth. She flinched slightly, not from fear of him, but with the wary reflex of someone who had been struck too often to guess the next move. His anger rose not at her, but at whoever had left those marks on her. Ironfoot blew and dropped his head toward the water trough. Grant motioned with a quiet hand. "Water's there." She hesitated, then guided the gelding forward, drawing a bucket with trembling fingers. She let the horse drink first, then cupped her own hands for a sip, water running down skin streaked with dust and bruises. No thief, Grant decided. No thief would care for a horse before herself, or stand unshaken in a stranger's yard when escape was easy. He weighed his choices. Send her back into the scrub, where hunger or worse might claim her. Drag her to town for strangers to judge. But the memory of Rose Steele's last silent gaze cut deep. He couldn't turn this woman away. The rifle suddenly felt heavy. Grant leaned it against the porch post, a single motion that spoke the choice he'd made. She watched, eyes never leaving his. Without a word, she sank onto the step by the trough, wrapping thin arms around her knees and resting her head, as if the strength to sit upright had finally drained away. Dirt streaked her skin. Bruises mottled her elbows, and a torn patch bared the curve of her thigh. Grant looked aside, but the image stayed sharp, stirring feelings he had long buried. Ironfoot's unexplained flight now made sense, no coyote chase, but a purposeful ride that had carried her here. Responsibility settled on Grant, heavier than fear. Fate, or the horse's own will, had set this in motion. He exhaled, slow and steady. You can stay. For now. She lifted her head just enough for their eyes to meet. For a heartbeat, relief flickered there, small but certain. She gave a faint nod and lowered her gaze again, the quiet of the yard wrapping around them both. Inside the cabin welcomed them with the lingering scent of wood smoke and yesterday's beans. Grant Steele knew he should offer food and a blanket first. Questions could wait their turn. Ironfoot snorted by the trough, shaking his damp mane, and for the first time in months, Grant felt something close to gratitude toward the horse that had returned, bringing more than it had carried away. Jaw set, he stepped aside and motioned toward the open door. The decision was made and couldn't be taken back. The young Apache woman hesitated, eyes searching him as if to be sure this wasn't another trap. At last, she rose, her bare feet dragging in the dirt, and limped slightly as she crossed the yard. Grant noticed that falter and wondered how many miles she had walked before Ironfoot found her. He pushed the thought aside and swung the door wide. The one-room cabin smelled of pine and faint ashes. A tin cup, a plate, a crust of bread, and a pot with a few beans were all the table offered, stark in the light of another person's gaze. He pulled a chair closer to the stove. Sit. She studied the chair as though unsure she belonged there, then lowered herself stiff with fatigue and caution. Grant ladled beans into a tin plate, set it in front of her, and slid a fork across. She paused, glanced at him, then ate quickly, but without greed, each swallow the careful measure of someone unsure when the next meal might come. Grant leaned back, arms folded, silent, his mind running with questions he wasn't ready to ask. When she finished, she pushed the plate back. He poured water from a jug and offered it. She drank with both hands on the cup, fingers trembling, water spilling down her wrist. Then she murmured soft words he didn't know. Apache perhaps, music, low and fading. He simply nodded. From a pine trunk in the corner, he took a folded wool blanket and laid it on the table. She touched it gently before wrapping it around her shoulders. The sight stirred a feeling he'd long shut away, protective and unsettling all at once. Grant sat across from her, jaw tightening as he searched for words. None came. She looked into the fire, then back at him, then down at her hands. At last she lifted her chin and tried in broken English, "You know, Sen." The question was more a test than a plea. "No, not tonight," he said quietly. She searched his face, perhaps weighing whether to believe him. The chair creaked as he leaned back. He knew if the Dust Creek settlers heard of her presence, they would judge without mercy. Yet the thought of sending her away, and remembering her eyes barefoot in his yard, would cut deeper than their scorn. She shifted, drawing the blanket tight. That's when he noticed the bruises on her wrist, dark finger marks pressed into her skin. Cold anger ran through him. He'd seen such marks on prisoners hauled in by lawmen and on women no one had shielded. He looked away, jaw clenched, unwilling to force answers she wasn't ready to give. Breaking the heavy silence, he pointed toward the small bedroom. "You take that. I'll keep watch." She looked from the room back to him and shook her head. "No, I sit." He didn't argue. Instead, he dragged a chair to the door, set his rifle within reach, and settled heavily. She lay down near the stove, cocooned in the blanket, still keeping her face turned toward him, even as her eyes closed, ready to wake at the first hint of danger. Firelight flickered over the rough log walls, across the gentle curve of her shoulder, where the blanket slipped. Grant shifted uneasily, willing himself to focus on guard duty rather than her nearness. It had been years since another soul had shared his space, and already the air felt changed, warmer, weighted, less lonely. He despised himself for noticing. Worse, for wanting her to stay. Through the long night, he weighed the risk of keeping her the danger of men who might ride in after her rifles ready. Yet memories of endless empty nights of grief that never loosened its grip returned just as strong. For the first time in years, he was not alone. Near dawn, the fire faded to glowing embers. Grant hadn't closed his eyes, but he wasn't tired. He kept watch while she slept. Her breathing slow and steady, the bruises on her arms stark in the soft light. One truth settled deep in his chest. He could never turn her out. Not now, and likely not ever. Morning crept in soft and silver when Ahyoka Moon stirred, blinking awake on the cabin floor. Grant Steele watched, waiting for words that never came. She only sat up, tightened the wool blanket around her shoulders, and began to braid her dark hair with careful, deliberate motions. Grant sensed then that survival was nothing new to her. She had been enduring long before Ironfoot brought her here. Maybe, just maybe, they could weather the world together. The gray light widened across the pine floorboards. Grant rose from the chair by the door, stiff from a sleepless night, eyes gritty but sharp. Ahyoka was already sitting near the stove, her braid neat down her back. In daylight, the bruises on her arms showed darker, the lines of fatigue more pronounced, yet a steady calm lived in the way she held herself. She had made her own choice. In the night, she would neither beg nor run. Grant stepped outside, first boots crunching in the hard dirt. Ironfoot lifted his head in the corral, ears flicking. Relief struck again at the sight of the gelding alive and whole. Grant ran a rough hand along the sweat-dried coat, checked hooves and legs, then patted the strong neck. Ironfoot had carried her far and come back unhurt. That counted for something. When Grant turned, Ahyoka stood in the doorway, blanket wrapped close, bare feet on the cool boards. The land here cut sharp. She couldn't stay barefoot for long. He thought briefly of the worn boots stacked in the corner, keepsakes from earlier years. He'd find a pair later. For now, water, he said, motioning to the well. She nodded and crossed the yard carefully, filling a bucket that wavered in her small hands. He stepped forward quickly, taking the weight before it tipped, setting it on the porch with ease. Her quick glance back wasn't quite thanks, more a quiet acknowledgement that he hadn't let her struggle alone. Inside, Grant sliced bread and a piece of salt pork, setting them on the table. This time she ate slowly, testing the idea that the meal wouldn't be taken away. Between bites, her eyes roamed the cabin, over tools hung in neat rows, the rifle by the door, the stacked firewood lingering longest on a picture frame, turned face down on a shelf. Grant noticed and quietly moved it. He wasn't ready to place Rose Steele's memory in the same room with the woman before him. After breakfast, he nodded toward the axe. Wood. She hesitated, then followed him out. Grant split the first log clean and passed her the handle. Her first swing barely nicked the grain. She looked at him, bracing for anger, but he only split another log and handed the axe back. She tried again, harder, the blade biting deeper, though the log held. He caught the darkening bruise on her wrist as she strained. Enough. Not today, he said gently, taking the axe and setting it aside. She stepped back, frustration flashing, but relief too. Grant didn't ask her name that morning, though it pressed at his tongue. Instead, he showed her the chores. She carried water, swept ashes from the stove, gathered scraps of cloth to mend her dress. He offered her an old work shirt, coarse and long. She slipped it on without shame, sleeves loose, and hem brushing her knees. Seeing her in his shirt unsettled him in a way he couldn't name, yet he didn't take it back. As the sun warmed the yard, they worked in companionable silence. She washed tin plates while he repaired a broken corral rail. She braided cloth into twine while he cleaned his rifle on the porch. Now and then their eyes met, neither looking away first. Later, when he led Ironfoot to the shade, Ahyoka approached, laying a gentle hand on the horse's neck. Ironfoot shifted once, then stilled, accepting her touch, as if she had always belonged. Grant felt a tightness in his throat. The gelding had never welcomed anyone without his say-so. Something unspoken passed between woman and horse acceptance, maybe trust. Toward evening, she gathered small stones and twigs, grinding them into a fragrant powder that she sprinkled over the bruises on her wrist. The sharp, earthy scent filled the air. Grant understood she carried knowledge of healing deeper than anything he knew. She gave him a brief glance that warned him not to interfere. He didn't. As night settled, he cooked another pot of beans. Ahyoka sat near the fire, sewing careful stitches to mend her dress with a needle and thread she'd found in his trunk. More than once, he caught himself watching her, the play of firelight on her shoulders, the quiet focus in her eyes. When she noticed, she held his gaze a heartbeat before returning to her work. After supper, she folded the blanket around her and lay near the stove, but this time she didn't face him directly. She turned slightly, a quiet sign of trust. Grant cleared the dishes and set his rifle by the door. The cabin fell still, yet for the first time in years, that stillness felt less like loneliness and more like the start of something he could not yet name. That quiet shift struck Grant Steele harder than he expected. He settled again in the chair by the door. Rifle close, eyes fixed on the thin cracks of moonlit shutters while thoughts turned like restless wheels. Under his own roof, on his own land, he now shared fire and silence with someone else. That fact alone meant the trail of his life had already bent in a new direction. As the fire burned low, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and breathed a low whisper meant only for himself. "You're here now." The words weren't for Ahyoka Moon, so much as for the stubborn part of him that still fought what Ironfoot and maybe fate itself had already decided. When he glanced back, she was fast asleep, breathing slow and even, wrapped in his blanket, his rough shirt loose on her frame. The room's stillness felt different, no longer empty, but alive. For the first time in years, Grant didn't dread the coming sunrise. Morning air bit cool as he stepped outside with a bucket to draw water. The well rope creaked, and behind him came the soft scrape of the cabin door. Ahyoka followed barefoot into the yard, his shirt draped over her shoulders, the blanket still around her. Grant's eyes fell to her feet, raw and scratched. At last he said more than a single word. "You'll need boots." She didn't answer, only lowered her gaze, her long braid sliding over one shoulder. Grant studied her a moment, set the bucket aside, and walked to the shed. He returned with an old pair of boots, cracked but sturdy, and placed them on the porch without a word. Ahyoka bent, slipped them on. Too big, but they would hold. She pulled the blanket closer and straightened as though the boots themselves marked her claim to stay. They shared bread and beans again. He caught her eyes flicking toward the near-empty shelves. Supplies were thin. Soon he would have to ride to town, a thought heavy with choices. Take her and risk stares and questions from the Dust Creek settlers, leave her alone, and trust that the cabin could keep her safe. He pushed the decision aside. One day at a time. After breakfast, he led her to the corral. Ironfoot nickered softly as she neared, and she stroked the horse's mane with easy confidence. Grant watched, then spoke the question that had sat in his chest since her arrival. "Horse carried you here?" Why, Ahyoka turned dark eyes steady. "Horse found me." "Knight, you take it," he pressed. She shook her head, voice low but sure. "No. Horse come." The certainty in her tone and the gelding's calm told Grant all he needed. An animal doesn't lie. As the day stretched on, he showed her more chores. She toted small buckets of feed, swept the cabin floor, stacked the wood he had split. Every move she made was measured, thoughtful, less like a wanderer passing through, and more like someone building a place. By midday, he led her down to the creek. Cold water sparkled under cottonwoods. He knelt to fill canteens. She crouched nearby to drink from cupped hands. A breeze loosened strands from her braid. When she bent forward, the collar of his shirt gaped, and for a breath he caught the soft curve beneath. Heat rose in his chest. He turned away, jaw tight. When he risked another glance, her eyes met his steady, unflinching. She neither hid nor looked aside. The silence between them thickened like warm earth. Grant cleared his throat and capped the canteens, focusing hard on the trail back. Boots crunched on dry ground as they returned. Back at the cabin, Ahyoka began patching her torn dress with careful stitches while he mended a broken saddle strap. Their eyes met often now, each look holding a little longer. As the sun lowered, Grant brewed a small pot of coffee. The bitter aroma filled the room. He poured 2 cups, sliding one toward her. She looked surprised, then lifted it and sipped slowly. After a quiet stretch, she spoke, voice husky from little use. "Name: Ahyoka Moon." Grant paused, the name settling in the room. He nodded once. Grant Steele. Speaking his own name aloud to someone after so many silent years felt strange and new. "Ahyoka. Grant," she repeated softly, tasting each sound. That night she lay near the stove again, blanket drawn high. Grant sat in his chair with the rifle within reach, but the air had changed. Names had bridged a distance. Before closing her eyes, she murmured, "You good man." The words landed deep. He wasn't sure he deserved them, but he let them stand. Leaning back, he watched the fire's last glow and felt for the first time in years that the quiet inside his cabin carried peace instead of punishment. At first light, Grant rose. The sky stretched pale over the mesas as he readied Ironfoot for a supply run. Beans flour coffee nearly gone. Waiting longer would only make the ride harder. Grant Steele worked with slow, practiced care as he checked Ironfoot's cinch and pulled each strap snug. His hands stayed steady, but his thoughts tugged in a dozen directions. He hadn't ridden into Dust Creek since the night the gelding vanished, and now he carried more than an empty pantry on his mind. Ahyoka Moon waited in his cabin, and if the town ever learned of her, they'd never forgive it. She stepped out while he tightened the saddle braid loose from sleep-borrowed boots, scuffing the hard earth. Wrapped in his blanket, she stopped a few feet away, eyes dropping to the packed saddlebags, before lifting to meet his. She didn't speak, but Grant heard the question just the same. Would he leave her behind, or take her along? He cinched the strap with a sharp pull that made the leather creak. "Found," he said flatly. Her brow furrowed, lips pressed tight. She moved a step closer, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "Me?" she asked, voice quiet but clear. He shook his head. "Too dangerous." Images flashed in his mind, faces turning whispers, rising, rough hands dragging her from the saddle before he could raise his Winchester. He wouldn't throw her into that circle of hate. A flicker of something fear, maybe hurt, crossed her eyes. Grant met her stare and kept his voice steady. "I'll be back." The weight of those 3 words pressed hard. If he failed to return, she'd face a hostile land alone. She gave a single small nod, but he saw how her fingers clenched the blanket. Grant stepped to the shed, brought out an old double-barrel shotgun, and leaned it inside the doorway. "If trouble comes, use it." Ahyoka looked from the gun to him. She didn't nod, but her grip on the blanket eased the gesture itself a kind of answer. Grant rode out under a pale blue sky, the land stretching silent and wide. Each beat of Ironfoot's hooves tangled with thoughts of the woman waiting behind. He pictured her by the stove, alert to every sound, and hated leaving her. Yet worse would be the Dust Creek settlers learning who sheltered under his roof. By the time he reached the edge of town, talk already followed him. Neighbors eyed Ironfoot the bay they'd whispered about for days. At Hank Rourke's store, the clerk gave him a narrow look. "Heard that bay of yours bolted. Thought you'd lost him. Found him?" Grant said the word clipped. The man smirked. "Funny. Tracks said he ran clean off." "Where'd he turn up?" "Found him." Grant repeated his tone, shutting the door on further talk. The clerk shrugged and set to weighing flour. Grant bought beans, coffee, salt pork, and a length of cloth, speaking little. When Jed Pike ambled in and asked if he'd seen any Apache sign in the hills, Grant's hand twitched near his rifle. "No," he said, and left it there. He rode hard for home supplies, packed tight, heart thudding. By late afternoon, the sun slanted gold across the scrub. Smoke lifted from the chimney ahead, and the knot in his chest eased. She was there. She had stayed. Grant dismounted and carried the sacks onto the porch. The cabin door opened a cautious inch, and Ahyoka stood framed in the light blanket around her shotgun in hand. Her knuckles were white until she saw him. Then she lowered the barrel shoulders sagging. He stepped inside and set the provisions on the table. She helped wordlessly, stacking flour and beans, eyes flicking over the goods with quiet approval. Only when everything was in place did she speak. "You back?" Her voice was calm, but relief shone in her eyes. "I said I would," he replied. That night, as the fire sank to embers, a new ease filled the cabin. She had trusted him enough not to run. He had trusted her enough to leave her armed. Seated near the stove, Ahyoka glanced at him, lips parting as if to say more. Instead, she reached for the cloth he'd brought and began stitching with steady hands. Grant watched the firelight play along the slope of her neck, the strands of hair slipping free. She sensed his gaze and didn't pull away. After a long while, she set the cloth aside and looked straight at him. "I stay," she said. "No question, no plea, just quiet certainty." Grant felt his chest tighten around a truth he could no longer deny. Grant Steele thought of Rose Steele's lonely grave, of the long years of silence of neighbors in Dust Creek, who still whispered about him, but all of it felt far away beside the woman across the table. He gave a single sure nod, the weight of choice settling deep. "Then stay." The fire cracked softly, and the silence thickened. For the first time in years, Grant let his hand rest lightly on the table near hers. Ahyoka Moon glanced down, then back to his face. After a quiet moment, she set her fingers over his warm, steady, without a tremor. The fire burned low, its flicker dancing across rough pine walls. Their joined hands stayed still, neither of them pulling back. Grant felt the warmth of her touch sink past every locked door in his heart, loosening burdens he hadn't known he carried. She held his gaze, dark eyes unblinking, while the only sound was the soft settling of embers. He cleared his throat, voice rough. "You should rest." Ahyoka studied him briefly, then nodded and wrapped the blanket closer. This time when she lay near the stove, her eyes closed, without the wary flicker of watchfulness. She trusted him enough to sleep. Grant sat long in the doorway, chair rifle within reach, but his eyes kept drifting to the figure curled by the fire. Memories of Rose in her final days, and of all the silent years that followed, crowded close. He had sworn never to open that part of himself again. Yet here she was, brought to his door by the very horse he'd once thought lost breathing steady under his roof. Maybe the silence that defined his life was never meant to last. At dawn, she stirred first, setting the kettle on the stove and feeding the fire with careful hands. When she saw him watching, she offered the faintest nod, almost a smile. He rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped out to check the cattle. She followed in the boots he'd given her, blanket snug around her shoulders. Together they walked the fence line, Grant scanning for breaks while she watched the horizon, as if expecting riders. Back inside, over coffee and bread, she spoke in halting English. "Men. Bad. Take. Hurt." Her fingers touched the dark bruise on her wrist. Grant's jaw tightened. He had suspected, but the few words confirmed more than he wanted to hear. She gave no names, no place, but the meaning was clear. She had fled cruelty and would never go back. "They won't find you here," he said, steady and sure. She seemed to believe him. Her shoulders eased. The day filled with quiet work. She finished stitching the last tears in her dress, while he showed her how to salt pork and stack wood for winter. They repaired fence boards together, their hands brushing now and then, eyes meeting longer with each glance. By late afternoon, when he passed her the hammer, her fingers lingered against his. He didn't move away. That night, the fire burned bright. Ahyoka sat on the floor, sewing her braid loosened until black strands slipped across her shoulders. Grant watched, chest weighted with something more than desire, something deeper, steadier. He stood crossed the room and crouched beside her. She looked up, calm and unafraid. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. She didn't flinch. For a long heartbeat, their eyes held firelight between them, and then he leaned in slowly, giving her room to turn aside. She didn't. Her lips parted, breath warm. Their first kiss was careful, but sure. His calloused hand cupped her cheek. Her fingers gripped the fabric of his shirt. The moment was brief, but it changed everything. When he drew back, he searched her face for regret and found none. Her steady eyes held something new, acceptance, even belonging. She touched her lips softly and whispered, "Grant." The sound of his name from her mouth tightened his chest. When she lay by the stove that night, she didn't curl away. The blanket slipped enough to reveal the gentle curve of her shoulder, her hair fanned across the floorboards. Grant sat in his usual chair, but the space between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bridge waiting to be crossed again. As the fire dimmed, doubts pressed in. What if the men who hurt her came? What if the town discovered her? What if losing her later hurt worse than past grief? Then he looked at her sleeping face and understood the sharper fear letting her slip away before she chose to stay. Leaning forward, elbows on his knees, he whispered into the quiet cabin. "You're safe here." She didn't stir yet, her hand eased from beneath the blanket resting open on the floor between them, as if waiting for his. He didn't take it, not yet, but knew he would before long. The morning after their first kiss, The air in Grant Steele's cabin carried a quiet charge neither of them tried to name. He rose as always, boots rasping on the pine floor, while Ahyoka Moon stirred near the stove. Instead of turning away, she sat up and met his gaze. Dark eyes, calm, steady, as though what had passed between them was not a mistake, but something decided. Grant gave a small nod. She returned the gesture with a subtle tilt of her head. He stepped outside to draw water. She followed, pulling his shirt close around her shoulders, the borrowed boots still a little loose. Ironfoot lifted his head as they neared. Ahyoka stroked the gelding's mane and whispered something soft in Apache. Grant listened, but didn't ask. Back inside, she was already at the stove grinding coffee beans with patient rhythm. The sight caught him off guard, her moving easily in his space, as though she had always belonged. They ate bread while salt pork sizzled crisp in the pan. Once her hand brushed his on the table, and neither moved away. The silence between them had weight now, but not emptiness. Later he saddled Ironfoot for work along the ridge. She walked beside him with tools in her arms. When he reached to help, she shook her head, stubborn, determined to carry her share. On the ridge, they worked shoulder to shoulder, replacing rails and tightening wire. Sweat beaded on her brow, stray strands slipping from her braid. Grant felt the urge to tell her to rest, but he knew better she needed to prove her strength. Still, when she faltered against a rail, his hand shot out to steady her. She looked at him sharply, then softened, letting her hand linger against his before stepping back. By afternoon, dark clouds stacked along the horizon. The wind picked up and faint voices rode the air. Men's voices. Grant froze, rope in hand. Ahyoka stiffened too, eyes cutting toward the open land. Far off, 3 riders moved slow across the scrub-black shapes against the sky. Too far to recognize, close enough to make his chest tighten. He guided her down behind a thicket until the riders drifted out of sight. She crouched silently, fists gripping the hem of his shirt. When they were gone, he exhaled, jaw hard. Could be nothing, he said, though he didn't believe it. Her long look told him she didn't either. That night, a heavy storm rolled in, drumming the roof and shaking the walls. Inside the stove glowed red, casting warm light over the cabin. Ahyoka sat close legs tucked beneath the blanket hair, damp from catching rainwater in the basin. Grant took a seat beside her, closer than usual. The storm howled, but inside it was still. She reached out her hand, finding his on the bench. He turned to meet her eyes, and saw not fear, but a clear choice. He shifted closer until their shoulders touched. She leaned gently against his arm. For a long time, they stayed that way, the storm outside and the fire steady between them. When she finally lifted her face, he bent toward her slower but sure. Their lips met again, firmer, more certain. Her fingers curled in his shirt. His hand rose to the back of her neck. The fire popped sharply, breaking the spell for a breath. She rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Grant." He closed his eyes, chest tight with all he felt and all he feared. Later, instead of taking his chair, he lay on the floor beside her. At first he left space, then let his arm slide gently across her waist. She moved closer, settling against him. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm of sleep. Grant stayed awake long after listening to the storm fade, thinking of those riders and the danger beyond their small ring of firelight. But more than danger, he felt the woman beside him, her choice to stay his own to protect, and for the first time in years, he wanted more than survival. When dawn broke clear, the land smelled fresh and sharp. Grant rose quietly so as not to wake her, and stood at the door scanning the horizon. Trouble might still come, but inside the cabin, Ahyoka slept in his blanket braid loose across the floorboards. He knew what he would fight for now, what he could never afford to lose. She woke soon after stretching as the morning light poured in. Seeing him at the doorway, she came to stand beside him. For a long moment they looked out together over the endless quiet. Then in halting English, she said softly, "They come back." It was not a question. Grant's jaw tightened. He had seen those riders and knew they hadn't been wandering. Men didn't circle this close without a reason. He turned his hand, brushing her arm. "Who are they?" Ahyoka lowered her gaze, lips pressed tight. After a long pause, she whispered, "Silver Canyon riders. Men from ranch. Take women. Me." Ahyoka Moon's voice cracked on the final word, and cold fury rooted deep in Grant Steele's chest. He gave a single hard nod enough. He didn't press for details. He didn't need them. The day moved in uneasy quiet. Grant mended the corral fence with slow, precise strokes, but his eyes kept sliding to the ridge. Inside, Ahyoka cooked beans, swept the floor, stitched cloth. Her motions stayed steady, yet tension tightened her shoulders. The silence between them was no longer emptiness. It was a held breath waiting. Late in the afternoon, the stillness broke under the beat of hooves. Grant stepped onto the porch with his rifle. Ahyoka slipped behind him. 3 riders crested the rise, coming slow and deliberate. The lead man, lean sharp-eyed, grinned. "Heard you've been hiding a stray cowboy. An Apache girl, ours for the taking." His voice oozed the swagger of a man used to seizing what he wanted. Grant brought the Henry to his shoulder stance, wide and calm. "She's not yours," the man laughed. "Don't tell me you're keeping her. You know what folks will say you had her over. Hand her back and we'll let it be." His eyes slid toward the doorway where Ahyoka stood, pale, but unflinching. Grant never looked back. His gaze stayed fixed on the men. "Set 1 foot closer," he said, "flat and cold, and you won't leave." The air tightened. The riders shifted hands, brushing the grips of their pistols. For a long breath, it seemed steel would clear leather. Then the lead man spat in the dust and jerked his reins. Not worth dying for. He wheeled his horse. The others followed. They rode toward the ridge until the horizon swallowed them. Grant kept the rifle leveled until the land lay empty. Then he turned to meet Ahyoka's eyes. She stepped forward and laid a trembling hand on his arm. "You safe?" she said, voice rough. He shook his head. "We're safe." The correction mattered. He wanted her to know she was no longer alone in the fight. That night the cabin felt changed. Danger might return, but the choice between them was settled. She wasn't leaving, and he wouldn't let her go. After supper, she set aside her sewing and came to him by the fire. Her hand found his sure and warm. This time he didn't hesitate. He drew her close until her head rested against his chest and her breath matched his. For a long while, they sat like that, the fire holding the world at bay. When she finally looked up, strength shone in her dark eyes. "I stay," she said again, firmer than before. Grant touched her cheek with a rough, gentle hand. "Then stay, with me." Her lips curved into the smallest smile. When they kissed this time, it carried no question, only promise sealed in firelight. Later, they lay side by side beneath a shared blanket. The grief Grant carried for Rose Steele remained, but it no longer chained him. The silence that had haunted his years had broken not by talk, but by the steady presence of the woman beside him. Days fell into a natural rhythm. Ahyoka moved through the cabin as if she had always been there, cooking, mending, tending Ironfoot. Grant worked the range and fences, drawing her into every task and trusting her with the work. They shared bread, coffee, and long, easy silences that felt full instead of empty. Weeks later, when Grant rode into Dust Creek for supplies, the Dust Creek settlers watched with the same sharp eyes and low whispers, but their judgment no longer weighed on him. He bought what they needed and rode home. Seeing smoke curl from the chimney, his chest eased. She was there, waiting. One evening as the sun bled red over the hills, Grant stood by the corral with Ahyoka at his side. Ironfoot grazed nearby the horse that had once vanished and carried her into his life. Grant wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, eyes on the wide horizon. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to decide. She had chosen to stay. He had chosen to keep her. The cowboy who thought he'd lost everything had not only his faithful horse back, but the woman who returned love to his life. Together they faced the endless land, no longer alone. For the first time in years, Grant Steele believed the future held more than silence. It held family. It held love. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.